Hey, hi, Allison.
Hi, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
Glad to be here, excited for our conversation.
Yeah, me too. I'm so glad to get to talk to you. I know this is a really sensitive but very important topic. Yeah, obviously I work in public health and you have been doing like amazing work at Miscarriage Hope Desk and I'm just yeah, it's like so important. I use your resources a lot and refer people to you a lot because this is just like it's a tough period. I've been through a miscarriage and I feel like I at the time um I think that's how I found you actually because I was really like it was just a hard like there's not a lot of resources out there and yeah. So anyway, I'll let you kind of take over from there, but if you want to kind of tell people just a little bit about you and why you founded Miscarriage Hope Desk.
Yeah, so I went through some very unexpected struggles in my journey to build a family. I will give you the abbreviated version, but not to say that it's not a very hard and difficult time that I went through, but I had a total of six miscarriages. I have one biological son and two adopted sons. In going through my journey of recurrent losses, I really struggled. I guess I'd heard of a friend that had a miscarriage or maybe two, but when I
Mhm.
kept having them over and over, I really felt lost and couldn't figure out, like, I had trouble finding resources and other women that had gone through a similar struggle. And I decided to do something about that. I think it was like three losses in. I was like, I need to help create this resource that's just not
Yeah.
there. And so I founded Miscarriage Hope Desk, which is now a nonprofit. We provide all sorts of resources to women struggling with a miscarriage, multiple miscarriages, any sort of losses. We have a free mentorship program and just all sorts of resources for women that are struggling like I was so that they can feel less alone in what can be a very lonely time.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. It's so needed. So, yeah, I think it's obviously a really emotional thing to go through. And I think part of that too is people have different reactions. And so like everyone's, miscarriage journey is different. Um, what kind of advice do you have for people who are going through kind of either recurrent miscarriages or just the emotional aftermath of a miscarriage?
Well, and like you said, I've been through several losses, and I will say
Yeah.
each of them was very different for me. Like I experienced them in a different way. The grief hit me in different ways. I went through a loss already having kids. I went through a lot of losses before having kids. All of them were difficult in one way or another, but just
Mhm.
different degrees and struggles and things that can happen. And I think the most important part is to kind of create space to go through that. Like, know that there's going to be some difficult times and figuring out a way to allow for that, and allow the space for the grieving to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there, do you do you feel like there's sometimes when there's like emotions that, yeah, I mean, you said kind of creating that space, but like emotions that kind of take you off guard or like moments that, like I saw on your website, there's, kind of having a pregnancy after a loss and that kind of thing. Do you have like, I guess, the advice for people who are kind of going through that, experiencing either like numbness or anger or guilt, shame, um, creating space, but yeah, how I guess what's the best way to do that or to create space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be tricky, right? Because there's,
Mhm.
yes, a lot of the emotions will catch you off guard. I still to this day will have things that sometimes catch me off guard, like something will trigger me. Especially the thing that I guess I wasn't expecting the most was like milestones. So like something will happen and I'll look on my calendar and realize, like, oh my gosh, this was the day of the loss a year ago, or this
Yeah,
was the day of the DNC, or this, was a significant day. And even if I'm not aware of that, it's like my body remembers. And so I'll
yeah,
go back and realize, like, oh, that's what it is. Or, it can be as simple as someone saying something or seeing something that, triggers a memory. Of course, one of the best things is, some sort of mental health, like, finding some therapy. For me, I did something called EMDR, and I found that the most effective for really processing through my emotions. Especially, I think any miscarriage has a good likelihood of causing what they called a trauma. And with EMDR, it kind of helps you process through those emotions. Not to say they're not there, but it allows me to, now I can speak about each of my losses without breaking down. And in the beginning, I did break down, and that's fine. That's totally normal. But over time, it's important to process through those emotions and not hold on to them and carry them through. As you mentioned, a pregnancy can be really difficult after loss, being able to enjoy the pregnancy, being able to not be triggered. Ultrasounds can be terribly triggering. So all of those things. And then in terms of like tools to get through it, I mean, there's so many, and I think it's just finding what works best for you. For me, journaling is a really big one. Just writing out my feelings, my thoughts, my emotions. I actually got so into writing that I started writing. And at the current moment, I'm in the middle of writing a memoir because I just couldn't stop writing about it.
Yeah.
So that's still to come. And, just anything that they recommend for stress can be really helpful. So for me, going on walks, especially going on a walk without my cell phone, just to kind of like clear my head. For me, I try and clear space first thing in the morning. So that's like going on a walk or meditating or sitting in silence. So that way I can kind of give that grief a chance to appear early on and get it out of my system. So then that way the rest of the day I'm a little less likely to have it pop up because I've already kind of given space for that. And then finding someone, I mentioned the therapist can be super helpful, but I think also finding someone that has been through a similar experience or that you can talk to. And, you would be surprised how many women have gone through some sort of miscarriage or loss. So there's probably a friend or a relative that you have that could, kind of help walk you through that. That's one thing we have at Miscarriage Hope Desk. We created a free mentorship where it's women that have gone through it that then turn around and help someone else that's going through it. And the idea is that it kind of it's very healing if you've gone through it to then help someone else go through that. And so it's like this amazing cycle where we've already had some of our mentees turn around and be mentors for the next round. So that's been really cool to see.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And I found with the mentor-mentee relationship, it's kind of like both of them are really benefiting in the relationship. So that's been really cool and something I've been really proud of Miscarriage Hope Desk.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. Especially that it's like a free service that it's like developing a friendship and like a little bit of like a match situation, which is really cool.
Yep.
Do you have any tips, I guess, for on the provider side? And we didn't necessarily talk about this before, but when, because especially when I'm talking or seeing someone for the first time and they mention they've had miscarriages, do you have any like advice as a provider for ways? Because I know how like I would like to be responded to, but obviously that's very different. I mean, usually it's just like, I'm so sorry to hear that, and then kind of like moving on. But yeah, do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, it is tricky because like we said in the beginning, like everyone can handle things differently and even with me for each loss, like, and so I think it's kind of on both sides. Like, I think just being sensitive to it, asking about it though, like I think so many times because it's sensitive, people don't want to ask, but so often, even if it is hard to talk about, even if there are tears, I think a lot of times people do want to talk about it. They do want someone to ask, people won't and they don't. And I've talked about this, but that was one of the nice things in going through my loss with having kids is my kids would continue to bring it up. And even though it was hard and I would cry, it was nice to have someone that would still remember and talk about it because otherwise so often it doesn't get remembered or talked about. So I think asking is always a good thing, a good approach, like kind of ask and then kind of see how much they talk about it and open up. But a lot of times no one does. So I think they'll just appreciate being asked about it and then kind of going from there.
Yeah, that's great. That's good advice. I just for providers and for friends, I'm sure, and everyone. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really cool. That made me like emotional with
I
talking
know.
about kids. I'm like, oh, that's so sweet.
Well, I
Um,
think also a lot of times without even recognizing it, if that is still there and there are like a lot of unprocessed emotions, it can prevent a lot of like forward momentum, and it can prevent, optimal health if you're, a health provider. Those
mhm.
blocked emotions and not processing them can really get in the way of not just, moving forward in fertility, but, moving
Right.
forward with mental health and other areas of health.
Yeah, your body definitely keeps the score for sure. So I
Mhm.
mean, we definitely see that pop up, especially in pelvic floor physical therapy, that, you're, even if, like you said earlier, even if you feel like you've kind of processed it, your body is still kind of holding a lot of that trauma.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, kind of speaking of that, do you obviously, like, the pregnancy loss affects more than just the person going through the loss, but do you have advice for, or what advice do you give partners who might be either experiencing different emotions, maybe not feeling as attached, or yeah, or having a tough time with that as well?
Yeah, it's so tricky, and for me and my husband, it's really helped us to learn a lot about each other. And
Yeah.
I say, and actually, I do think for most of our losses, it really brought us closer together. But I think it can actually do one of two things: it either brings you closer together or it pushes you further apart. I do
Hmm.
think we had one loss where it did sort of drive us apart temporarily. I
Yeah.
mean, we're totally fine, but I mean, I think
Yeah.
that is something to be
Very
um, aware of, and uh, the main thing is just this like communication of what I need, and realizing that's probably not just male female, but just person to person is going to be different, right? Like, do I need you to sit here with me and give me a hug, or do I want to like have some space and like some alone time? And
good.
if it's different for both of you, you have to figure out how to maybe give something that isn't what you would want. So it's a little counterintuitive. Like, okay, he wants space, but I would want you to sit here with me. So it kind of like figuring out that and being able to openly communicate that. At one point with Miscarriage Hope Desk, I even created like a long checklist, like check the things that I would want, and then have the partner check the things you would want, and
Oh
then
yeah.
swap. So it
That's
can
really
be like this open conversation of like, these are the things that would really help show me that you're here for me and caring for me. Um,
hmm.
and going both ways, right? Like, even if
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time, he may not be sitting, well, my husband wasn't sitting on the floor sobbing, but he was having a difficult time. And so
Hmm.
making sure that he, had a space to process that. And I have noticed that sometimes if we have, a friend in our friend group that goes through miscarriage, he will reach out to the husband, and that's really special. So maybe keeping that in mind too, after you've been through it, is like, hey, maybe reach out to so and so's husband, because that doesn't happen very often. And I think that's,
Yeah.
can be really helpful for them to have someone reaching out as well.
Yeah, that's really cool and important. That's really neat that he does that, because I feel like that is really easy just for sometimes just like men in general, and then also when you're not the direct one
Hmm.
experiencing the loss. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you um sorry, I was looking at my questions and I was like, I don't know that this is necessarily a good transition, but is there anything, I guess, about the similarities or differences on how someone processes like a miscarriage after one miscarriage or having multiple? I mean, you kind of already touched on that. And just kind of like like each one is a little bit different. Does it help to have like some experience, I guess? Is there anything like
Yeah,
you?
I mean, yes or no. Like, I feel like
Yeah.
it can just be sometimes it can be a little more frustrating, I think, like, oh, I've been through this so many times, I should figure this out already, but that's just not
Mhm.
the case. And each one comes with all of their own nuances. And for example, like having the last one, that's something, going through that of like, okay, but I'm not going to try again after this. So that's different. And so sometimes,
Yeah.
and especially, and again, it doesn't have to be multiple. If you have one, but it was like, well, that was my third kid and I always wanted a third kid, that can be really hard, because
Yeah.
you know that you're not going to, for whatever reason, you've made the decision not to try again. So then there's like multiple levels of grief, because it's not just the loss, it's also the loss of like trying again and all of that possibility. So there's just so much that goes into it. And I think just being able to look at each loss in its own way and figuring out what is it about that loss that's hard for you. And again, this is where journaling or talk therapy, really being able to
Yeah.
process it and figure out, it's not so simple. Like there's always multiple things going on, and that's okay. And that's where going back to the space to grieve, like having that, being able to take, figuring out, can you take time off work? Can you, cancel some things on your calendar and make the space to kind of process things and figure them out and
Yeah.
realize that it's multi-layered when you are going through something like a miscarriage.
Yeah, that's a really good point of like the last, yeah, just like how each one is different totally. And then especially like that last one can be, yeah, a really heavy,
Mm-hmm.
heavy thing. Um, which I feel like is also hard when you just like thinking about what people tend to like say or how they respond to someone who has had a miscarriage. I
Uh-huh.
was thinking about just like even I had one miscarriage, but just like people would, say like at least you can get pregnant, or like if you have other children, at least like that at least kind of is like
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're like, well, that's not really how I'm looking
Yeah,
at or
so
EMD
I'll touch
values
on
with
that
grief.
because
Yeah.
yeah, I know this, and this gets thrown out a lot. If you're on, so at Miscarriage Hope Desk, we have a pretty
Mhm.
popular Instagram account, and I know on social
Yeah.
media, like, oh, people say the worst things, and they do. Um, I try as much as possible, though, as like someone that's, gone through it, to be like, you know
Mhm.
what, people say really awful things, but they are trying to help. And so
Yep.
I really try and focus on it's coming from a good place. They don't know what
Yeah.
to say.
Uh-huh.
All of those at leasts can be really hurtful. If
Hmm.
you're looking for something more helpful to say, just kind of opening an ear, being like, how can I help? Or just offering the help, or just showing up with a meal or a cup of coffee or whatever it
Yeah.
is. Versus trying to like cheer them up with these like platitudes that are not helpful.
Yeah.
But just kind of being like, hey, I'm here if you need anything. Hey, I'm sending you a text, just want to check in. Or I know this is hard. Like kind of just, those sort of things. It is hard. So not trying to like breeze over that and be like, oh, it's fine, or at least this, at least that. So I think it goes both ways. If you're on the, trying to cheer up and maybe
Yeah.
just more offering an ear and letting them know you're there. And then also if you're in the, hey, I'm hurting end, realize, yeah, what they're saying is hurtful, but it is coming from a good
Good
place.
point. Yeah.
Um, but it's still okay to be hurt by what they're saying, just trying
Yeah.
to not hold it against them for too long.
Yeah. It is so hard because, yeah, I mean, I think you learn too when you go through something what feels good and what doesn't. And
Mm.
um, yeah, it's hard to know like each person experience like just on any level, grief can be experienced or like what feels helpful and what doesn't
Mhm.
is not, is different for different people. Um, I know this is kind of like your job. And like I obviously refer to you a lot, but like kind of hitting on that like practical level, um, being an open ear and that kind of stuff. Is there anything that like is pretty consistent that people say like in the mentorship program that is helpful for them, or just kind of like having community and friendships is
Yeah, I mean, I think just knowing, and I'll just say from my personal perspective, like I wanted to hear stories that like what I was going through was normal. Like, okay, maybe it's not
yeah.
normal, but like there are other women that have gone through this. There is such a thing as having, 6 losses or 10 losses.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's really awful, but you're not the only one, right? Like
Right.
it does happen, and people get through it. They get up to the other side, and it's hard getting through
Right.
it. But
Yeah.
it is like this, just seeing that there's others out there and they're not alone, I think can be really comforting. And then, there's a little like small things within there, but I think like the big overarching thing is being like, I'm not alone. This is like, there is this community of people that are having similar struggles. Uh, is helpful to know.
Yeah. 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 Do you feel like that gets into, I know that your nonprofit is kind of focused on just like support. Is there I guess, resources within that or things that you like? Because I know part of it is just that on the provider side, a lot of times it's like, this is normal. Like, like it can almost be too um normalized sometimes on the provider end, like on the, I
Yes.
feel like as a person going through it, you feel like you're the only one that's ever been through it because it's not talked about enough. And then on the provider end, they're like, oh, like just kind of keep trying or like that, just kind of being like, this is super normal, super common. And you're like, meanwhile, you're like, this is so heavy and I feel like
Yeah.
I'm alone. Um, are there resources within what you do, or like do you have resources for like how to talk to like an OB or your provider about like getting more testing and that kind of stuff? Or
Yes, absolutely.
okay.
And just because like we were saying like, okay, this is common doesn't mean it should be
Right.
happening. There's not
Yes.
something going on. So
Right.
yes, that's definitely like, let's focus on the grief first. But then after that, before you keep trying over and over, there are so many tests that can help see if there's like something that you're missing,
Hmm.
that could maybe be, corrected or addressed. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's not obviously like, it's not really how we're designed as like you having losses. So there is something going on, and
Right.
trying to find that is really important. So yeah, after the grief piece and getting through that, or, kind of after that's been at least addressed, that's a really big, important part of why I put together Miscarriage Hope Desk. Is I had a lot of doctors that would just give me like, oh, it happens, or let's wait until 3 losses, or let's do, they wouldn't really dig in deep. And I'm like, look, if this has already happened twice, like, why am I going to keep going?
Yeah.
Like, we need to do tests. And in fact, there are some things that could be figured out in a series of tests. And it's like, if you don't address that, it's going to keep happening.
Yeah.
So we do have a lab checklist that we
Oh,
give out
great.
for free, anyone that signs up for our newsletter.
Hmm.
And you can take that, see what tests have I done, take it to your doctor and work with them on that and be like, which tests have we not done? And if not, why not?
Hmm.
Because some of them, for example, if there's a structural issue that's preventing a pregnancy from sticking, until you address that structural issue, it's going to keep happening.
Right.
And blood work, there's a lot of different blood work you can do both for you and your partner. It took
Hmm.
several losses before anyone would look at my partner, but the sperm is 50% of an embryo, and that 50% can prevent the embryo from sticking or the pregnancy from maintaining. So even if a doctor is telling you, well, you're getting pregnant, I don't need to look at the sperm, you actually do. There's a lot of different issues that can go on with that. We have some articles on our website on those.
Okay.
So there's just a lot that can be looked at. And I think it's important to find a doctor that you know, like, and trust. But then also, it's important to be your own advocate. It's important to have a spreadsheet with your own labs. Don't just leave that for them. There can be gaps. They're seeing a lot of people. Maybe they didn't realize we didn't check vitamin D. Maybe they don't realize, like, oh, there is this thing here that we missed even checking.
Hmm.
So some of those are important to, at least look at, to make sure there's not something, I hate to say simple, but sometimes it is something that is not that difficult to address, that can be addressed, that might significantly improve your chances in the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there things, because I know sometimes too, like prepping, one thing that I work on, even just like when we're, in a pregnancy, is like prepping for, like, unfortunately, if you do, like having a plan for like, if you do lose either like a child at like the end of your pregnancy, like what are some things that you can like ask for in the hospital, which is like a hard conversation, but it's so important because then later you can't go back to that moment, and be like, oh, I actually did want to do, an autopsy or things like that. But that gives you so many answers, a year later when you're trying to make more decisions. Are there things like that when you're like experiencing a miscarriage, or that people should know, like, okay, maybe I'm not prepping for that, but just like in the back of my mind, like if this happens, I know these are the things I need to ask in the moment, like if I have a DNC or
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one you hit on, and that's, if you can save, like if there's an embryo or baby to save and do testing on, that can be really helpful to know. Like,
Mhm.
it's easy to be like, oh, it was probably just genetic issues. Well, you can test for that. So test for
Right.
that, see, so then. And even then there are things that you can do. A lot of times I think doctors like be like, well, there's nothing maybe there wasn't anything you could have done like in the moment, but that doesn't mean there aren't things you can do in the future to improve your chances, especially if you have information on what happened or didn't happen. So the more information, the better. I'm a big fan of
Yeah.
information and testing and knowing and becoming knowledgeable. Like if it's important to you to, build a family and go through this, then it's important enough for you to take charge and have a grasp on all of that and be able to ask, and I say ask educated questions, but don't be afraid to ask a question even if you don't fully understand what it means. Like,
Yeah.
ask the doctor, have them explain it to you, have them take the time. I mean, that's something with the articles we did at Miscarriage Hope Desk, I was really big on is like, I'm not just going to like make this watered down, fluffy article. Like, I want to go in depth. What does the research say? Why is this? Especially the things that I would see on Facebook groups of like, oh, just take a Benadryl because that calms your immune system. Well, why are they saying that? And is there any truth to that?
Right.
And what does the research say? That's what we really need to be looking into and talking to doctors about, not just finding something like, oh, well, so and so that I don't know across the country on a Facebook group did this and magically it worked. Well, let's not just go there. Let's be a little more like research and evidence based.
Yeah, because I mean that is such a huge gap as we start to see like healthcare kind of, I mean, it's been kind of an ongoing process, but especially like women's healthcare and like honestly just stuff that's like harder, like
Mhm.
pregnancy loss and just, like things that take more time on a provider end to like sit down and explain, and they are seeing so many people, and it's a wide, I'm sure it's like so hard as like there's a wide range of like personality and like the amount
Uh,
of information people want to know and that kind of thing. But um yeah, having like a resource like that that's like on the back end that you can like, if you feel rushed in a doctor's appointment, it's like, okay, now I can go here, like read this article that's like research based and not like the Facebook groups can be so helpful for people, but it's like just there's no like you're just, yeah,
yeah,
it's just a personal experience, not like,
exactly.
yeah. So but that's so good because yeah, making the provider sit like slow down and explain to you and just asking the questions, that's really good advice. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. um Do you have like other, I guess, big messages that you think is important to convey? I feel like that was a really big one, just like talking through like how to handle it in the moment. But is there any other like, I guess, themes or big things that you see that you're like, oh, if I could just get in front of people like either before they have a miscarriage or like before they have their next miscarriage, like advice or just anything. It's okay
Yeah,
if
I
not.
mean, I think those are kind of my big things. One is like if
Yeah.
you've gone through it, give the time and space to heal, to go through the grief, all that. Being your own advocate, and then just like not getting overwhelmed. There's so much you can do, and believe me, in the like years that I went through it, I did it all. Acupuncture,
Yeah.
abdominal massage, and this and that, and they're all great, but don't feel like you have to do all of them. Find what really like feels right for you. So I think there's kind of two pieces to that advocating for yourself piece of like, yes, like doing the test and all this, but also like just listening to yourself and where you feel like if there's something that is really calling to you, like, oh, I really feel like I want to do acupuncture sounds like it would really be helpful, then do that. But if you're like, acupuncture scares the hell out of me, I don't want that, that's going to be like, if it's going to be frightening to you, don't do it.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes for like testing or something that's wrong. If you have a gut feeling, really learn to tune into that. It's really easy with all of this to kind of tune out and like separate from your body and kind of like, I guess, not trust your body, right? Because it let you down. But I think it's
Mm.
important to try and stay in touch with your body and tune with your body. You know your body better than anyone. So if there's something that you feel called for in your heart, then really listen to that too. I think there's kind of like a balance of both pieces. So
Yeah.
there's something there that's like tugging at you, don't ignore that either.
I tell people that all the time because it's just, you really do know your own body best. And even if you feel like disconnected or something, it just like usually your body is like bringing something up that is important. Like I always tell people, you end up at the right, in pelvic floor PT at the right time. Like people will be like, I wish I did this years ago. And it's like, well, you ended up here at the right time for like your body and your situation and like when it's right for you. And I mean, the same goes for really everything. It's like you just have to kind of have in parenting, right? Like you just kind of have to go with like yeah, there's too many opinions and too much out there to do it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's really good. Well, sounds like we're preaching the same thing, so that's good. I've learned a lot from you on your Instagram over the years too, so good. Okay, well, so Instagram we've talked about, that's where we can definitely find you there, and that's just Miscarriage Hope Desk, correct?
Yep.
And then your website was pretty easy to find too. Just miscarriagehopedesk.com, is that right?
It's .org now that we're so
.org. Okay. I was like, I just Googled it. So it pops up when you Google
it'll
it for
it'll
sure.
still pop up for both though.
Okay, good. Okay, perfect. And then your website is phenomenal. Has so many resources on it. To get signed up for the mentorship, is that on your website? I don't know.
That is just contacting us at support
Okay.
at Miscarriage Hope Desk, and that's still .com. But it's mentioned on the Instagram. The other big thing we have is we have a newsletter that's now been switched to Substack. There's on the website, you can sign up for it, so I can give you that link, but you get the
Yeah.
free download of the lab checklist. And, I'm doing newsletters 2 to 4 times a month. And then eventually there'll be the book, hopefully in the next year or so. But
Great.
yeah.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, we'll put that information in the description too, so everyone can get to it. But
And then
yeah,
I should
thank you.
mention we have a podcast. There's no new
Okay,
episodes
great.
right now, but there's so many, especially going back, like stories of hope, listening to other women, like going through there,
Good.
finding something you can relate to, and that like maybe it's just so helpful to hear stories. So we have
Yes.
some of those on our website,
Okay.
but also on the podcast that I think no matter timing, like those are still good to go back in the archives.
No,
So
those are great. I have listened to a couple of those and they're so good. That's a really good resource. I think, yeah, it's great to have like several options of like what feels best to you in the moment of like what you're willing
yeah.
to like take in. Sometimes social media can be like that's too much, but
Yes.
having the time and space to listen to a podcast is great. So
Great.
very helpful. Well, you're doing amazing work. Thank you so much for like what you're doing. It really is making a huge difference. And yeah,
Well,
it
thank
was
you.
great to,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
appreciate
good.
you giving me the space and you taking the time to shed a light on this because again, so often people are afraid to talk about it. And I think it's just important to have the conversation going and it'll help a lot of women. So thank you too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Yeah, look forward to talking to you more.
Sounds good.